Today, I think that we have an opportunity to kind of see how a couple pieces work together. We've been going through the book of Acts. We've hit 16 and 17. We're talking about the missionary journeys of Paul and his friends after Jesus had sent the church on mission, right? To go, therefore, into all nations, teaching them everything, baptizing them, telling them about Jesus, teach them how to follow him, right? Don't just keep it at home, but take it throughout the whole world. And we get to be a part of that same mission. And today we're going to look, we're in Acts 18, but what we're going to do is we're going to kind of like sidestep a little bit. Paul wrote a couple of the epistles while he was on his first and second journeys. And so we're going to highlight a couple things in Galatians and 1 Thessalonians specifically. And then we're going to see how it ties into Acts chapter 18, and more than that, how it ties into our life and how we can continue to live. Because Paul and his friends experienced a lot of opposition, didn't they? Right? Opportunities to quit, opportunities to, like, man, this is ridiculous. And I know that nobody in here ever feels like quitting, but Paul had every opportunity with stubborn believers, with people taking the things that they've been taught and like going back the way that they had come. People, physical harm and reputational harm, which for whatever reason seems to get us a lot more than physical harm would. That our reputations might be damaged, right? Anybody have a green thumb in here? Not a real green thumb, that it references, all the kids are like, I don't think so. Anybody great with plants? Like you plant something, just grows, right? You love to. I obviously don't. I like plants, and I would like to have a green thumb. I'm not patient enough to be a gardener. I have grand visions of how I can grow my own food and all these things. But my tendency is this. I plant a plant, and I want it to grow. And I put the fertilizer on, and I water it, and I want it to grow. Because that's what its job is. Its job is to grow. And when it doesn't grow, I might give it a little extra love, but if it doesn't grow or it dies off, I'm going to rip it out and put a new one in. Because it takes perseverance and patience to plant and see things grow. Right? Anybody, maybe it's, have you ever got a spot on a shirt, like your favorite shirt? Right, there's this saying, like there's a process that's on the back of those bottles. Wash, rinse, repeat. That's stupid. See, because what it should be is wash, rinse, and the spot's out. Right? I don't want to have to do it twice or 3 times because the directions don't say once or twice. It just says wash, rinse, repeat. Wash, rinse, repeat. If it doesn't work the first time, do it again. That's the implication. Well, like the plants, if the shirt doesn't get the spot out the first go around, I'm probably going to throw the shirt away and just buy a new one. And with plants and with shirts or other things like that, it might be reasonable to toss it out and get a new one. But I wonder how often we do this with people. I wonder how often we do this with those we maybe lead to Christ or share the gospel with or are making disciples of, and we want the same thing to happen. Well, I told you about Jesus. Don't you believe now? Right? Or oh, you believe, but why aren't you growing fast enough? Or don't you know you're not supposed to do that? And don't you know that you're just supposed to look like Jesus? And if we're not careful, we can treat people like plants and shirts, and we can just kind of go, well, I guess it's not going to work. I'll just start on a new one. And what we do inadvertently is we leave in our wake half-grown Christians because we have a difficult time not quitting on people and ourselves. Listen, maybe you're not the one growing. Maybe you're the one who needs growth. And somebody had told you about Jesus and you willingly came to Christ, but you feel like a 4-year-old still spiritually because you were trying and somebody saw that it wasn't good enough and they moved on to something new. And if that's you today, be encouraged. God's not done with you yet. And if you are the one who, like me with clothes and plants, has a tendency to maybe stop when it doesn't work right the first time, I want you to be encouraged today too. That it's always too soon to quit on your faith, on people when they don't do it right the first time. It's always too soon to quit on your marriage. It's always too soon to quit on your teenagers. It's always too soon to quit, especially when it comes to making disciples and sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ. Spoiler alert, that's the whole sermon. But we're going to look at it today, how we see it here, okay? And I'm going to start with Galatians and 1 Thessalonians, because Paul, as he's on his missionaries, remember, he went up and he wanted to go to Asia. God said, no. You remember this? He said, no, you can't go to Asia. I want you to go over here. So he goes up into Galatia. Galatia is an area north of Antioch where they were sent out from, right? They were commissioned. See how this all comes together? They were commissioned and they were sent out. They wanted to go one way. God said no. They end up in Galatia, and it's an area, it's a province, and there are many churches that ended up starting there. So the book of Galatians is written after his first missionary journey through there, and so he goes and he writes to them as a means to keep going. If you want to go to Galatians, flip to Galatians. It's on page 972. That one never gets old. He gives a greeting and he reminds them, remember, there were people who were trying to get, do you remember how this all went? If you go back into Acts 15, 16, 17, we talk about these first and second missionary journeys, and there were people trying to get them, it was Jesus plus, do you remember that? Jesus and the law, Jesus and being a Jew. And he starts Galatians. Here's the highlights. We're not reading the whole book. Don't worry. We won't be here that long. But he says, I'm astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. See, people had come in after Paul and started to pervert the gospel, started to teach them something else than what they had heard about the grace of Jesus. And have you ever been frustrated at somebody that you were trying to help get better and they didn't take it? Maybe it was a kid, or maybe you've been in youth ministry, so you just live frustrated all the time. Or worse yet, adult ministry. Then you're always frustrated. Think about this, where you're trying to teach somebody, and he told the gospel, and they're like, oh, we don't have to be all of this other. It's Jesus only. You remember that? He had an opportunity to quit on them. He didn't have to go and keep encouraging. He didn't have to go and fix it. He chose to persevere in that, even though he had plenty of opposition while he was there. Remember, opposition follows the work of God, right? Opposition from the enemy is always trying to come against the work of God in the world. And as we share the gospel and as we are making disciples, it will require perseverance and patience. Wash, rinse, repeat. So he had washed and it rinsed, and now he's repeating because they needed adjustment, they needed help, they needed growth. Chapter 1, it says, look, I'm not seeking the approval of man or of who am I seeking approval from, man or God? He says, I'm not trying to please people. If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ. He's saying, look, stop trying to become like everybody else wants you to do and just do what he says it is. Galatians, we find out in chapter 2, this is the same book where you hear these wonderful words, though through the law I died to the law. This is chapter 2, verse 19 to 21. It says, I died to the law so that I might live to God. Verse 20, I have been crucified with Christ. Do you remember this? You might have this on a bumper sticker. You might have it on a t-shirt. This is where this is found in the Bible. I've been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. He's adjusting their understanding again because he was unwilling to quit on them to help them grow. Chapter 5 in Galatians, he says, for freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore. What he's doing is he's helping them. He's having to persevere and be patient as he's growing the Galatian church, encouraging them, admonishing them, hoping that they're convicted by God's Spirit to live for Christ alone. And he's telling them you have to stand firm. The words he's using, the language he uses is of perseverance, of not quitting. He says, stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. He's saying, hey, I know the pull to go backwards is strong, right? I know the pull to go backwards to the easy way, right, is strong, but you'll end up in bondage and slavery, right? That's not what God called you to. He called to set you free to live for Christ. And then chapter 6 in Galatians, right? And so this letter was not a church he wrote to, but the church, Big C church. And it was meant to be shared with all the churches in that area. So the letter to the Galatian church, the Galatian Big C church, right? There wasn't like first Galatian church of Galatia. Like it was a bunch of churches that the letter was spread around to. Brothers, if anyone is caught in transgression, sin, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of, what does it say? Gentleness. Restore him gently. Right? When people who you are ministering to are trying to raise in the Lord, we don't look perfect right away. Are we gentle in our adjustments? How are we with our kids or our spouse just in life? Are we gentle in our adjustments? With one another in the church, with your pastor, please be gentle. And do you know why I say this? Think about how God deals with you when you haven't been perfect right away after accepting Christ. What does the process of your sanctification look like? That process of becoming like Jesus. That's what sanctification is. It's taking us from where we were, making us holy, which is an ongoing, all the time process until you die, right, on this earth. And if we can't do it, why is it that we expect everyone else to? If we can't fix it on the first go all the time, why do we expect other people to do something we aren't able to do ourselves? You ever ask yourself that? Self-awareness is super key in the process of sharing the gospel and making disciples. Otherwise, we tend to fall on moral Christianity, the idea that morality is the standard of salvation. All that is legalism and the law. We are saved by grace through faith so that no one can boast. It's not how moral you are, it's what Jesus accomplished on our behalf. And he goes on, he says in chapter 6, he says, keep watch on yourself lest you be tempted also. Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. And then verse 9, the same chapter, and let us not grow weary in doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, especially those who are of the household of faith. He says, it's always too soon to quit. 1 Thessalonians. He wrote this on his second missionary journey. Remember, we just talked about Thessalonica. It was not an easy mission there, was it? Again, a ton of opposition, another opportunity to quit. Right? Another opportunity to give up, another opportunity where there was not a ton of fruit, but what do you do? Have you ever been discouraged? Have you had seasons of being discouraged? Anybody? Where it's like, God, I'm doing all this work. Do you see me? I'm doing all this work. I told listen, I might be in the 5th grade, God, but I told somebody about Jesus today. Right? Do you see me? Why isn't it working? Why won't these plants grow? God, I'm putting the fertilizer on. God, it doesn't seem like what I'm doing matters. God, all these people are terrible. They're talking mess about me. Right? Nobody has stoned us yet, right? Nobody has thrown us out of the city. We haven't chased out of anywhere yet. What does Paul and his friends do? What does he write? Because he goes through Thessalonica and he talks to them about it. He first commends them in chapter 1 of 1 Thessalonians about their faith and their example, that the word's getting out about what's happening there. Right? Chapter 2, he reminds them of his time there. Right? We read about it in Acts. Now we read about it in the letter that he sent. For you yourselves know, brothers, that our coming to you was not in vain. Yes, it was hard. Yes, it took a lot of effort. Yes, there was opposition. Yes, we could have quit. He didn't have to send this letter. He says, but it was not in vain. But though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated in Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God, not boldness in ourselves, boldness in our God, to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict. In the midst of much conflict, we had boldness of God to share with you the gospel of Jesus. In the conflict. How many are runners? Raise your hand. Just kidding, you don't have to raise your hand. In conflict, you have an aversion. You are like, I'm not dealing with this. I don't want to deal with it. I'm uncomfortable. I don't like it, and I don't like you, but I'm not going to deal with it. Some of us run away, and some of us run to conflict. Now, how you run to conflict, there's a whole other sermon on that, and we could talk about healthy, unhealthy running to conflict. Some of you like conflict a little too much. But this conflict can cause us to quit. And it says, look, we had pure motives, and we've been approved by God. He says the same thing here. He says, we didn't come with words of flattery in verse 5, right? Nor with the pretext for greed. We weren't trying to get paid for what we were doing. He says, God's our witness, and we didn't seek glory from people, whether you or from anybody else. We could have, but we didn't. And then he goes on in 1 Thessalonians to write to them to make some adjustments to say, hey, all the opposition is still worth it. All of the conflict is still worth it. Keep going. Here's how you live your life for God. Here's what a life after God looks like. No matter, don't worry about what anybody else tells you. Don't worry about all these new philosophies. Don't worry about all this mess and things that people want to draw you away and pull you back. He says, chapter 4 is about this life that is pleasing God. And then he talks about the coming of the Lord. Now, y'all want us to talk about, I know. Everybody wants to talk about when Jesus is coming back, how Jesus is coming back, and how everybody knows. Here's the reality. This is not what I was going to talk about. I'm going to tell you right now. Nobody knows when Jesus is going to come back, including Jesus. He said from his own mouth, I'll return, but it's only the Father that knows the day and the time. And it is very clear in the scriptures that you better be ready. Those are very clearly spoken in the scriptures. We can talk about it another time. Just want to throw that out there. At the end of 1 Thessalonians, flip to the very end here, chapter 5, starting in verse 12. He gives some instructions. Right? He could have seen this spot. He could have seen this thing, wash, rinse, repeat. Okay, wash, rinse, repeat. All right. And keep telling him, we got to keep encouraging him. How long do I have to teach you to follow Jesus? Oh my gosh, can't you get it on the first 3-4 times? Aren't you glad that God hasn't given up on you yet or on me yet? And he goes on, he says this, we ask you, brothers, to respect those who labor among you, right, and are over you in the Lord, and admonish you to esteem them highly in love because of their work. Be at peace among yourselves. And we urge you, brothers, admonish the idle. He says over and over in Thessalonians about idleness. Don't stop. Don't sit on your laurels. Don't expect it to happen by magic. Making disciples takes time and effort, intensity and passion, right? Urgency and care. It's too soon to quit, he says. Don't let yourselves get idle. He says, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, and be, the P word, patient with them all. If you've ever prayed for patience, you know what I'm talking about. The dumbest prayer in the world. But it takes perseverance and patience to make disciples and to share the gospel effectively. Do you hear those words? Encourage the faint-hearted, admonish the idle, help the weak, be patient with them all. These are words of somebody who is trying to make sure that his disciples don't quit. That there's always more to do. That the opportunity hasn't passed. As he is not done with us, we should not be so easily done with others. That's exciting. Galatians, 1 Thessalonians. Flip over to Acts chapter 18. See, because we're not raising plants and we're not trying to get spots out of clothes. We are tending to people, souls who have an eternity. And those souls will either spend eternity with God or apart from God. There is no middle ground. And the scripture says that the only way to spend eternity with God is through Jesus Christ, through his life, his death, and his resurrection. And that offers every single person on the earth hope for that eternity with him. And that those who reject God, as I did for so long, but if you die having rejected this gospel, then it is also clear that there's a time where we will all stand and there will be a division between those who accepted and rejected this good news. And the reality is none of us get to choose who that is and how it works. Wash, rinse, repeat. We have a job to do. And in the face of conflict and opposition, it doesn't matter because we have the opportunity to share that hope. And how dare us to decide who deserves to hear it or not? And how dare me to give up on somebody because they're not growing fast enough? Acts chapter 18, we find Paul in Corinth. And we're not gonna go verse by verse through this. You can read all of this chapter. I want to get to a particular space because we see something in action that we're talking about. Paul goes to Corinth. He meets Aquila and Priscilla, right? They are tent makers by trade. They share some time, and it says they were opposed and reviled. And it says they shook out their garments, and he said, hey, your blood's on your own hands. On your own head, rather. He says, if you reject, I can't do anything. I've done what I'm supposed to do. I washed my hands. The Lord will handle it. And he goes to the Gentiles. He did what he was supposed to do, and they went on. They talked to the Gentiles. And then God gave him some encouragement, saying, don't be afraid. I'm with you. I'm with you. Verse 10, for I am with you. Remember what Jesus said when he sent his people out on mission? He says, and remember that I am with you even to the very end. He stays there 1 year and 6 months in Corinth, even after there was all this opposition. And then Paul returns to Antioch. In verse 18, we find that he heads to Antioch, and when they came to Ephesus, Paul separated with Priscilla and Aquila, and then he did his thing in the synagogue, and then he set sail for Ephesus. He had finished his second missionary journey, and then we see this little piece between the end of 18 and 19 that I want to... It says, now a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus, and he was an eloquent man, competent in the scriptures. Like he understood when it says scriptures here, the New Testament wasn't the New Testament. He's talking about the Old Testament, by the way, right? The Old Testament. The Old Testament, the law, the prophets, all the history, all the poetry. And it says he had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, this guy was passionate. He spoke and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he only knew the baptism of John, which was a baptism of repentance. He had probably heard of Pentecost, but he had not experienced it, and so he didn't teach it. He didn't exactly know it, right? So he was teaching things accurately and well and passionately, right? But there was an adjustment, something that needed to be added to him so he could be more effective. And what you could do, it says this. It says he began to speak boldly in the synagogue, but when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, right, they heard and they were like, oh, this Apollos, he's doing the thing, but something needs to be added. There's something missing. He could be more effective. He could grow and he could add to what he is doing. And so rather than publicly shame him there, they took him aside and they explained to him the way of God more accurately. They saw there was something that needed to be fixed. And instead of going, hey, Apollos, I don't think you should be teaching anymore. This whole baptism, you don't seem to have the whole picture. They could have quit on him. They could have actually done a lot of damage there. They could have seen an incomplete man, a disciple that needed growing. It's like, why aren't you growing? Why don't you have that already? And said, well, sorry, you can't do this anymore, and set him aside. But they saw him. They invested in him. They grew him. They offered him something else that he needed. And then they trusted him to go out and keep going. It says he wished to cross to Acacia, which is where Corinth is. And the brothers encouraged him and wrote to welcome him. And when he arrived, this is what it says. He greatly helped those who through grace had believed, for he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the scriptures that Jesus was the Christ. So Paul goes, and he's in opposition, knows through perseverance and patience that it's always too soon to quit, right? And he kept on encouraging, kept on teaching, kept on growing. He was with Priscilla and Aquila. And they saw, and they did the same thing. They saw a man who was trying to fulfill his role in the kingdom, and instead of looking at his incompleteness as a reason to set him aside, they looked at it as an opportunity to grow him and set him loose. And in our disciple making and sharing of the gospel, it's always too soon to quit. On growing yourself, but growing others too. That man or woman, that young man or young woman who you've been working on, or who you'd hoped would get it sooner, it's too soon to quit. That marriage that's struggling, it's too soon to quit. That teenager that is off the rails, it's too soon to quit. That church member, it's too soon to quit. That pastor, it's too soon to quit on me. If we're going to see the kingdom of God grow and our gifts used for his glory alone, you and I will have to learn that perseverance and patience, not perfection and quitting, will be the call. So that we can raise up the Apolloses, we can raise up the Priscilla and Aquilas, we can raise up the places that we've been, the people that we've met in a more complete way so that they can also participate in the work of the ministry. Because God hasn't given up on you yet, has he? I wonder what our work would look like and our church would look like if when we saw that spot, we washed, rinsed, and repeated, and then we just did it till the spot was gone. Instead of just throwing it away, that plant, that tending that person with more care, more patience. One more time. Okay, let's do it one more time. Let that be your mantra this week. One more time, because it's too soon to quit. One more opportunity to tell them about Jesus, even if they reject me again. Students and kids, if you're in the room, listen. The rejection is always worth it to tell somebody about Jesus. The being made fun of is always worth it to tell someone about Jesus. Risking your job and your life is always worth it if somebody might enter into heaven with God, even if it means harm to you. Now, I'm not telling you to be ridiculous and unwise, but listen, sharing Jesus and not quitting on people is always, always worth it. What would Bayou City look like, I wonder, if we took this approach? What if we took the long game approach? Instead of the first time somebody disappoints us or isn't perfectly mature right away, we quit on it. I wonder what it would look like if we tried again and again. And we sowed the seed, and we watered the seed, and we tended the disciples, and we just kept on doing that. Some will fall away, some we can't. We're not responsible for the results. But what if we just kept doing that? And we just kept going, and we just kept going. And we remembered, I need to encourage that person. I wonder what would happen then. I wonder what the kingdom would look like in 2 years or 5 years or 6 months. Let that be our call. Wash, rinse, repeat. And it's always too soon to quit. Always. Let's pray together. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you, God, how it is one clear story. And how we can read one place and it refers to another place, and that your word is always a grounding foundation for us to know how to follow you and what to do with our faith. Thank you for the examples we have in people, but more than that, thank you for Jesus Christ who gave us hope